sins release us. Let us find our rest in thee. Our rest in
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Amanda Neppl, and I'm so excited to be here with you all this morning. And to those of you that are joining us in Waukee and at our local sites this morning, welcome. It's great to have you joining us today as well. That video that you just saw, if you were able to make it for Christmas Eve services, and if you were here early enough, you were able to see that video as part of our pre-service music, but you got to hear Lauren sing it live, and it was beautiful and amazing. And there's absolutely no reason why you should believe me when I tell you this. I mean, other than I usually tell the truth, but I had decided well before Christmas Eve services that I wanted to use that video in the message today. And then when I saw that we were using it for Christmas Eve, I had a little bit of a crisis. And then I decided to go ahead and do it anyway because it's so good. It is so good. And it is right up there on my Christmas must-watch list. It's like Elf and Christmas Vacation, and then Come Thou Long Expected Jesus is right up there for me. I love it because it is so beautiful. Isn't it beautiful? And I love the way it tells the story, the events. It reminds us of the people that we see there represented in the video, and even deeper into the Old Testament, the events that happened there. It reminds us of a time when God showed up and did something new. When God showed up and done something that had never been done before, really each one of those times. And God showed up through imperfect people who didn't know the end game. They couldn't have known where things were heading necessarily or how they were going to get there. And they weren't perfect. They made mistakes, but they trusted God just enough. They trusted God just enough. Even Jonah, by the end of it, trusted God just enough to be able to do what God had asked him to do, and that continued to march time and history forward until it culminated then with the birth of Jesus. And that's where we are today as we celebrate the birth of Jesus. Christmas was earlier this week, last week, however you want to look at that. And today we're in the Gospel of Matthew. We're in chapter 2. And so this has happened. This is an event that Jesus has come. The long-expected Jesus has come. And we're introduced now in a new way to this poor couple, this young man and young woman, who without being a part of this story would have been completely anonymous. But they are the ones who are responsible for bringing this infant, our Savior, the Messiah. They are the ones who are responsible for bringing him from infancy into adulthood. And they're faced with all sorts of different challenges and things that are going to come along with that. And that's what we heard in our gospel reading today in Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. We get introduced to this idea that things are not going to go so well for Mary and Joseph, and they are going to have to get out of town here as quickly as possible. We read here that Herod has decided that he is threatened by this little baby. And so Mary and Joseph hear this. Joseph receives this word in a dream. And so he's told that he needs to take his new family and he needs to get out of town. Now, probably what's really going on here, we don't know for sure how old Jesus was at this point, but probably between a year and 18 months-ish, we can probably say. And so Mary and Joseph have probably just really started to settle into this for a couple of reasons. Like, if you remember bringing home a new baby or you've known someone who has brought home a new baby, there is this period of time where you are pretty sure that you are going to break them because they're so squishy and vulnerable. And you're pretty sure that if you look at them cross-eyed, something is going to go wrong, They've gotten past that point, and they've also gotten past the point where Jesus is probably over a year old by now. And in that time and in that place, to get to your first birthday was a pretty big deal. If you got to your first birthday, you had a pretty good likelihood of seeing your second, third, fourth, and etc. But that first year of life was a pretty difficult and tricky time. So probably they have really just settled in. And they've probably just had a chance to exhale and really just started to think that maybe things are going to be okay when the angel shows up and tells Joseph that Herod is freaking out and they have to go. And from Joseph's point of view, I think about this and I wonder, as Joseph packs up his family and they prepare for this journey that's about 40 miles with a very, very young child, there had to be a point that was really the wondering was, is this how it's always going to be to raise this kiddo? Like, is this always what we're going to have to do? Is there ever going to be a time when we're not going to have to be terrified? Is there ever going to be a time when we're not going to have to look over our shoulder and wonder who's behind us, who might be looking for us, who might be wishing us harm? Is there ever going to be a time where we could have something that even closely resembles a quote-unquote normal family? He had to wonder if this is what this was going to be like forever. He had to wonder how he was going to support his family because, yes, he was a carpenter, but we're talking about a society where your reputation is everything. And if you have to pick up and go in the middle of the night more than about once, your reputation is definitely going to make it hard for you to do what needs to be done to support your family. And so being the parents to Jesus certainly did not in any way make Mary and Joseph's life any easier, not one bit. And I think that we think about that, we think about knowing Jesus and following Jesus and being a part of what Jesus is doing in the world. And there is a little bit of this sense of once I've partnered with Jesus, once I'm yes to that, then things are going to start to get a little bit easier, obviously, right? And we look at Matthew's words and we have to come to the conclusion that just isn't quite accurate. And that's the tension that Matthew is writing into in his gospel. That even though this was not what anyone expected, even though it didn't look anything like what people thought it was going to look like, it was nevertheless exactly what God wanted it to be. And nevertheless, it was exactly what we needed, whether we could recognize that and see that for what it was or not. Matthew is writing specifically to an audience in around 80 to 90, the year 80 to 90, and he's got three specific things that he really wants to address that he is writing into. And the first one that he wants to address with the people is division. The people that he's writing to are deeply divided right now at this point in history because there's a lot going on. There's basically 3 groups where there used to be one, really. And all 3 of these groups are laying claim to the same God. And it's kind of causing some discomfort there among the people. And so your first group of people that you've got are those that are traditionally Jewish. And these are the people that would trace their ancestry possibly all the way back to Abraham, maybe to David. Maybe they didn't know who they could trace it back to, but they just know for generation after generation after generation, this is what we've done. We worship the God we call Yahweh. The temple is very important to us. It's where we go and where we receive forgiveness. It's where we communicate with God. It's where God is. The temple is very important. Now, at that time that Matthew's writing into this, the temple has actually been destroyed. And so that's actually going to be one of the sticking points for those folks that are traditionally Jewish, one of the things that they're upset about. So we've got that group, and then we've got our Jewish Christians. So these are the people who used to be Jewish. They used to worship Yahweh, and now they've heard about Jesus. They've decided that that message is true, and they are following Jesus. And so the temple is not that, it's not a thing to them anymore. It's not a problem to them, really, that the temple has been destroyed because they are worshiping Jesus. The Holy Spirit has come. They know that they can receive forgiveness for their sins because Jesus was the final sacrifice. So the temple system and all of that just really doesn't matter to them. And honestly, that's a huge sticking point between these 2 groups of people because those 2 groups of people aren't just like one over here and one over there. We're talking about parents and children. We're talking about cousins. We're talking about neighbors. We're talking about people who used to worship together, who used to come together as a community and worship the same God. And now this group in the middle has said, no, we're following Jesus. You can keep your old ways. We're going to follow him. And so to this first group, it really is like a betrayal. So there's tension there. And then there's the third group, and these are the Gentile Christians. And this is just like a whole new thing. This is kind of crazy. Those who are traditionally Jewish cannot wrap their head around this. They're just shaking their head at the whole thing because these folks don't know anything about God. They haven't had to follow any of the rules. They don't even, half of them know what the rules are. They don't care about them. This is just completely foreign. And for this group in the middle, the Jewish Christians, they even resent the Gentile Christians because the Jewish Christians remember the rules and still kind of care about them. Even Peter, Jesus' disciple, if you remember the one that Jesus said, Peter, you're the rock, and on the rock, on you, I'm going to build my church. Even Peter had a really difficult time with the Gentile Christians because they didn't keep the rules, and Peter still had a hard time and thought the rules were really important. It took Jesus showing up to Peter in a dream and saying, Peter, relax, have some bacon, it's going to be fine. We don't need to worry about this. And it took Paul, who preached to the Gentiles, to come to Peter and say, you've got to get this figured out because this is going to get messed up if you don't figure out that we are actually one, that Jesus has come to make the circle bigger and not smaller. There was a lot of tension there. There was a lot of frustration and anger. And so when Matthew writes his gospel, he's writing it specifically to those folks who are traditionally Jewish with the intention being to show them that this Messiah, this one that they've heard about that has kind of stirred up a whole bunch of trouble, that this guy is actually who he says he is. And Matthew does this so wisely. He's so brilliant in this because he starts with what they already agree on. Matthew starts with the prophets. And the prophets were super important to those folks who were traditionally Jewish. Now, they didn't always like what the prophets had to say. They didn't always treat them really well. They oftentimes were pretty rude to their prophets and kind of kicked them out and did terrible things. But it was this case of nobody gets to pick on my little brother or sister except for me. Because my little brother or sister breathing drives me crazy, but I'm the only one who gets to deal with that. Nobody else gets to pick on them because they're very important to me. Nobody else gets to pick on them but me. That's kind of how the prophets were for those folks who were traditionally Jewish. They were very important to them, even if they didn't always honor them. And so Matthew really wisely starts there. And in the first 2 chapters of his book, he's going to go 3 different times and say all of this happened the way it was supposed to happen, like the prophet said that it would. He's starting with what they already agree on. And then he's going to build his case from there. And so when we see in Matthew chapter 2, verse 15, Matthew refers specifically to a section of Hosea, which we can read in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, where he says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt." And when Hosea writes that, he's not talking about Israel as a person. He's talking about the nation of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, those people who Matthew was writing to specifically, those who were traditionally Jewish. And he's writing to them, and he's saying, remember that time when Hosea said that? And if you are one of those people in the year 85, you're going to hear that, and you're going to say, yeah, I remember that time when God rescued us from slavery and brought us out of Egypt. I remember that. And if you go a little bit further, you're going to hear about how what Herod has done in Herod's hardness of heart. That's going to remind you of that one time when Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and that didn't turn out so well. And then if you keep going a little bit further, you're going to see that time in Matthew where he says, I brought my son out of Egypt. And you're going to say, yeah, again, I remember that time that we came out of Egypt. And then you'll be pointed to this one who's doing it again. Except for this time, this one who's doing it again, who represents Israel then, is doing it perfectly. And instead of making mistakes, this one is caring for the people that are supposed to be cared for, the folks, the oppressed and the poor that Israel was supposed to care for. This Messiah, Jesus, is actually doing it. He's making the circle bigger and not smaller. He's getting to the heart of the matter. Instead of just talking about the do's and the don'ts and things that you should do or shouldn't do or whatever, he's talking about how it's what's underneath. It's lining your heart up with the heart of God that gets us to the behaviors and the actions that the law was so worried about. Matthew is making a clear comparison between where the people have been and where they have come, and how this Messiah has shown up, and he's doing exactly what they did, but he is doing it perfectly. He's wanting to show them that even though it wasn't exactly what they thought it would be, it is still exactly what we needed. So he's speaking into the division. The second thing that Matthew is speaking into in his gospel is apathy. Because if you are a person who has been traditionally Jewish in the year 85, and you're looking around and people now want you to believe that this guy is the Messiah, this is going to be kind of a tough pill to swallow. Okay, you want me to believe this is the Messiah? Okay, great. Honestly, what difference does it make? Because I don't know if you know, but if you look around, everything is a straight mess. Do you know that there are Gentiles for crying out loud, that are worshiping God, the same God that we know? Do you know, as you look around, that our temple has been completely destroyed? The way of life that has meant everything to us is completely gone. And oh, by the way, look around. Have you noticed that Rome is still in charge? And it's a disaster. So if you want me to believe that this guy is the Messiah, you might have to help me understand what difference it makes. Because everything looks broken. And so Matthew's going to do exactly that. He's going to go through the rest of his gospel, and he is going to talk about how this Messiah, this Jesus, spoken by the prophets, is going to clean everything up. Matthew's going to show us piece by piece how this Messiah has brought the kingdom of heaven to earth. And it's going to be so awesome. We're going to spend the next 3.5 months in Matthew, and we're going to dig into this, and we're going to see, just as those original hearers heard and saw, how Jesus, God himself coming to earth, changed everything and means everything. It can't be just a little bit important. Matthew's going to show us how it is actually incredibly important. It's the most important. Then the third thing that Matthew is writing into is uncertainty. Because if that's the guy, and you know what, I might even be willing to try that on and wear it around for a while and imagine that this is true, but if this is the guy, we've been waiting for a long time. What do we do now? I mean, if this is the guy, what do we do? What do we do? And And in Matthew's gospel, he is going to show the people exactly what they can do. First of all, by the time we get to the end, by the time we get to Matthew chapter 28, Matthew is going to be very specific in what we can do. But in the meantime, while we're getting to that point, Matthew is going to say, you know what, for now, while you're trying this out, while you're wearing this around, remember. And in his first few chapters, he's going to do this in a really beautiful way. Down here on the bottom, this image is Jesus teaching, and for our purposes here this morning, that's Jesus teaching in chapters 5 through 7 of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount. And as Matthew lays out this case that Jesus is making in those chapters, if you are a traditional Jewish person in the year 85, you are going to hear that and you are going to remember that time when Moses gave you these laws and these rules and these things that were going to help you get along with one another. They were going to help you get along in the land that you had been promised, but something about just knowing what to do couldn't quite get it done. And so you're going to be reminded of that, and you're going to be reminded of the mistakes, and then you're going to see how in that remembering you're pointed to Jesus, who's getting really to the heart of the matter, literally, and he's talking about how it's not what we do, it's what's underneath there. It's our motivation. It's about lining our heart up with God's heart. So you're going to see how through people, this wasn't really done very well through Israel's history and Israel's story, but Jesus shows up and does exactly what needs to be done and redeems this thing and makes it beautiful. You're going to hear about that. You're going to look back and remember that time when Jesus was tempted in the desert. And if you're hearing this for the first time, because you're one of those original people that Matthew was writing to, you remember, I remember that time when our people wandered in the desert for 40 years because they couldn't stop worshiping idols. And so we had to get that straightened out. I remember that time. And now I hear about this Jesus who is spending one day in the desert for every single one of our 40 years, and he's fasting, and he gets to the end of that, and the devil tempts him and says, hey, are you hungry? And Jesus says, this is not my purpose. Bread alone is not my purpose. So Jesus has taken this thing that Israel did that went so sideways and so off the rails, and Jesus is redeeming it for his people, and he's making it perfect. And if you're a traditionally Jewish person in the year 85 and you hear about how Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River, you're going to remember that time when your people crossed the Jordan River. And before they got there, they had to stop, and they had to get caught up on the laws. They had to have their sins forgiven. They had to make sure that they were pure and that everything was going to be right for them before they entered the land that God had promised them. And you remember how God stopped the water so that they could go across, purified and new people into the land that God had promised them. And you're going to hear how, then you're going to remember how they got there, and things didn't go so great for very long. But this Jesus shows up and reminds you of all of that. And this man who had no sin goes into the river to be baptized to redeem what Israel coulda, shoulda done, but didn't, and do it perfectly and remind them of who they are and who that points to. And every single time Matthew in his gospel will show us, as he showed his first hearers, that it points to Jesus every single time. So in the uncertainty, his hearers can know that God keeps his promises and he fixes things that are broken. And he takes things that were dead and he brings them back to life. And he takes ashes and he makes them beautiful. Those are the things that Matthew is speaking to in 85. Division and apathy and uncertainty. And I think as we look at that list, we have to be reminded there's not really much new under the sun, is there? And I think if we look at that, we really are also faced with this idea that if any of us wants to say that the Bible doesn't speak to us today, or the Bible is irrelevant, I think we have some splaining to do on that point of view as well. Division? I don't know. I love like the end of a year, which is where we're at right now. This is the last time we'll worship together probably. Well, yeah, in 2019. Unless you come back at 11 or 5, I'll be here. We can do it again. It'll be fun. But this is the last time that we're going to worship together for 2019. And some people get kind of poo-pooey about like New Year's things and blah, blah, blah. I just appreciate any time, whether it's completely arbitrary or not, where we can kind of take a look at like what's been great. And that's what we're going to hear all over, media in the next couple days is the best of 2019, and because it's the end of a decade, it'll be the best of the decade or the worst of a decade or whatever. But I love this opportunity to kind of think about shedding things that aren't working and looking forward to maybe adjusting and doing new things. And we can do that at the beginning of the year. It happens sometimes as we head into summer. It happens a lot of times the start of a school year is an opportunity to do that for a lot of people if the school calendar is important in your life and impacts your life. So there's a lot of things about 2020 that I'm looking forward to that I think are going to be fantastic. I also know that particularly in terms of politics, 2020 could be a little bit dicey. Anybody think? I don't know, maybe. Here's the thing. Every single one of us, I hope we have this opportunity to be challenged. Every single one of us will probably run into somebody we love who has the audacity to think something different than we think. And when that happens, every single one of us has an option. And what Matthew would say to us is he would remind us that into division, remember that one time that this little Jewish baby was born under scandalous circumstances? And remember how the first people that visited him were the lowest of the low and the worst of the worst? Remember that? And remember how the people who visited him after that were magi from the east, which even in Matthew's day was a nice way of saying people not like us from far away who are kind of scary. And remember how this baby went from infant and brought all these people together and then grew up into adulthood. And remember how by the time this story is over, this man will have broken down every possible barrier that could separate us from God. Every single one. And this baby will show us in a way that almost nothing else can how God is perfect unity. God is Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And so we can have lively, respectful disagreements. We can have lively, respectful disagreements about things that are even really, really important. That at the end of the day, God is unity. Respectful disagreement, totally okay. But disagreement that is rooted in pride and self-righteousness and anger that leads to division, that's not of God. It is not of God. So we're going to do a little exercise to get us headed into 2020 on the right foot. So shake out for a second. You're going to take your hand. You're going to put it on your chest. And if you do this right, we'll get out of here early. So, I got nothing but time. It's really up to you. All right, repeat after me. There is no way I can be right 100% of the time. There is no way I can be right 100% of the time. Doesn't that feel good? Oh, what a weight off your shoulders, right? Okay, now, because you're itching to, if you came with someone and this needs to be said, feel free to look at them now and say, that is the first thing you got right in a while. I don't know. Some of you lean into that. I love it. It's great. We'll have prayer partners available after the service. We're going to talk more about that, I have no doubt. So for now, I'm just going to leave it there. God is unity. God is love. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Respectful disagreement, thumbs up. Self-righteousness, pride, and lack of humility, thumbs down to that one. The next one, apathy. This is so huge. This is one of the biggest things that I think as pastors we kind of run into. And I think if you've been in the world for 5 minutes, you know this. Because if someone finds out that you spend a Sunday morning or a Saturday night or X amount of time at church, one of the questions you're going to run into is, why? Why? And this is where I'm just going to shamelessly encourage you and invite you to come back next week, and really every week of 2020, because we are going to dig into Jesus in a way that we have never done here before. And what I believe is that when people are kind of shrugging their shoulders at Jesus and deciding that he's not really all that important, I think what they're doing is shrugging their shoulders at somebody that they really don't know. They know a version of him that somebody else has told them about. Maybe they're really intimately familiar with that version that's a little bit wonky. But for the most part, when we just kind of shrug our shoulders and assume that Jesus doesn't matter, most of the time we are shrugging our shoulders at the Jesus that isn't actually who Jesus is. Matthew is going to show us over and over and over again how Jesus is the kingdom of heaven come to earth. Come to earth to begin to set things straight, to take care of the things that we absolutely, positively, no matter how much we wanted to, could never take care of for ourselves. And he's going to show us a better way to live now, and he's going to show us the promise of our eternity. And if that doesn't matter, I don't know what does. So invite people, bring them to church this week. And if they have been taught a version of Jesus that made the circle small, they can worship online, dip their toes in every week at 11 o'clock, just to come and hear and discover for themselves who Jesus actually is, to dig into what he said and what he did, and to do it in a way maybe that's not scary, that they can do on their own terms. That's why, one of the many reasons why we do an online service. We want to make the circle bigger and not smaller. And if you have questions, bring your questions. If you're here today to keep somebody else happy, I'm really glad that you're here. And if you have questions about any of the things that you're hearing or any of the things that you've heard at church over your lifetime, come to Alpha. It is an awesome, safe place to ask your questions. All we ask is that you come with an open heart and an open mind and be willing to receive what it is that God might have for you in that. Try it on. Wear it around like it's true, like it's yours, and see what God might do in that. It's so important. It can't just be a little bit important. And then the last thing is uncertainty. We live in an uncertain world. We live in a world where people get hurt. We live in a world where terrible things happen. And none of us can afford to take today for granted. We know that. And Matthew is writing into an uncertain world as well. And Matthew is going to unpack all of the ways that we can trust God, all of the ways that God is going to do what God has said he has done. But just in the first few verses, Matthew clearly and powerfully reminds us of who God is and how God keeps his word. So we can do what Matthew wanted his very first hearers or readers to do. We can look at what he said. We can look at Matthew chapter 1 and just the genealogy of Jesus and the people who were a part of that. And we can read how Abraham was the father of Isaac. And we can remember that time when Abraham and his wife Sarah so desperately had a prayer on their heart. And they waited for years and years and years for that prayer to become a reality. And they tried to fix it themselves and they almost completely messed everything up, but God was still faithful to them in their imperfect faith, and how finally when they were 100, Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90, their prayer was answered. We can remember that time that God did what he said he was going to do. We can keep going. We can see that Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. And we can remember that time that Judah tried to treat Tamar like garbage. He tried to completely discard her, and God said, Judah, not today. And he saw Tamar, and he honored her, and she's part of the genealogy of Jesus. And we can go on. We can see that Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. And we can remember that time that God honored a poor, homeless, essentially, widow, and how she was faithful, and how God continued to be faithful to her. And if you're thinking, that's a great list, I don't know any of those stories, that's okay. Because all you need to do is open your Bible, and oftentimes in the notes, it will, if it refers to somebody back in the Old Testament, it'll tell you exactly which passage to go to read about that person. Alternatively, you could use the internet for good. And if you discover that you don't know who those people are, you could Google, it's amazing, Judah and Tamar, and I promise you, Google knows exactly where you can go to learn about those people. You don't even have to invest a red cent. Now, if you want to not have to do that, we sell study Bibles in the bookstore. You can also find an NLT study Bible online, and it will lay it out for you. The top half is going to be text, and the bottom half is notes. There are so many ways that you can dig into learning who these people are so that you can remember that time when God showed up and did a new thing. Even if you feel like your story is so far off the rails, like it is so complicated, like there is nothing that could possibly relate to my story. Okay, maybe. But even in that, you can remember that time that God called a young man and a young woman, and God came to earth to fix it. And by the time that man would grow into an adult and become a man, that man would go to the cross. So that even as each one of us walks through the valley of the shadow of death, we can remember that time when Jesus went to the cross and took care of that as well. Do you remember that time when God fixed that? We can always look back and remember that time that God showed up and God did something that nobody else could do and redeemed a story that nobody else could redeem. But remember when God did that? Over and over and over.